Okay, well, the panel is going to be a little different tonight. We will not have Ken Sorensen. He's en route to Perry for the contest down there. So he emailed me earlier today that he wouldn't be here. But we've still got Bob Wander as SSF advisor, Bert Compton as a trustee and FADP, and Rich Carlson as the chairman, and myself. And I told Rich I'd go through this slide briefly about the resources we have from the for the Soaring Safety Foundation. Flight instructor refresher courses. Rich Carlson and Glenn Collins primarily do those. The course outlines and presentation slides are on the Soaring Safety Foundation or soaringsafety.org website. Other instructors also help out with those, but primarily Rich and Glenn are the two primary movers with that. Safety seminars, Tom Johnson is in charge of those. And if you want a safety presentation, safety seminar presentation, or whatever at your club or site, that's we'll talk to Tom Johnson about it. Site surveys are conducted by Bert Compton primarily. I occasionally help out. We have a few other people that help out occasionally, but again, Bert is the person, the contact person on that. Condor-based flight scenarios and simulator scenarios. Scott Manley did those for our website. Practical tests, maneuver videos. Bert Compton did those. Flight training programs. We've got the Bronze Badge Knowledge Test, the Wing Runner course, and the Tow Pilot courses all on that website as well. And the flight safety programs, the SSA safety presentation, convention safety presentations are on that website as well for viewing if you want. And of course, these CFI-G training webinars are also on there. So we're going to talk about a couple of different chapters tonight. Effective communication, the basic elements, barriers, developing communication skills, and then we're also going to talk about assessment terminology, purpose of assessment, general characteristics and effective assessments, and so on and so forth. So critique, scenario-based training obviously is really an important part of assessments and training as well. So the basic elements of communication. This is the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, Chapter 4. This particular element is found on page 4-2. Effective communication is an essential element of instruction. You know, unless we communicate effectively with our learner applicants, they're not going to learn, and that's part of the teaching process. But you really want to make sure that you communicate. Sometimes that's may not be as easy as it seems. I mean, the FAA requires that all people be able to communicate in English for their pilot's certificate, but there's different variations of even English language, and you know, many foreign speakers speak English pretty well, but sometimes it's difficult to understand who they are or what they're talking about. Communication is a two-way process, so we have to make sure that we're communicating both receiving us as receivers and us as the source as well. So primarily as an instructor, you're acting as the source of the communication. Select and use language, communicators, self-image, ideas and feelings, using up-to-date, accurate and up-to-date and stimulating material. You know, like this book is really stimulating, isn't it? A little side joke there. We'll try to, try to make it as much as we can, but it's some of this material is a little bit on the dry side. So the source is usually the instructor, but also the source is the learner student that we have, because they're wanting to communicate with you as well as you communicate with them. And we'll talk more about these as we move through here. Symbols, we use simple, oral, visual, tactile, words and gestures. It's there's different methodologies for communicating, such as, if you want to talk about the walk around pre-flight inspection of the glider, the best way to do that is go out and actually have the glider there versus trying to talk about it orally. So you can visually see it and tactilely feel it as well. One area that I find that people are somewhat when they come to me to take a check ride, many of them don't know a lot about the disassembly and assembly process, and so I would highly recommend, other than the words in the book or the words in the manual, the checklist. I would highly recommend that you as instructors go out and show them, minimally show them where the pins and the how the hookups are conducted on the glider, whether they're whether they have to be safety pinned or not, and what are the safeties for the wing spars and things like that, so that they actually have a feel for what those words in the POH say about assembly or disassembly. I find that many applicants, when they come to me, they just haven't, a few of them have experienced the assembly or disassembly procedures, but many times they haven't really done it physically. They've just read things in the book or read the checklist that they've been given. And then in general, the receiver is the learner. They have different backgrounds and abilities. Some people are pilots coming to you and they're trying to get an additional rating. Some people are 14-year-old kids, who really don't have any background, or some may have background in aviation, but many of them may not have any background in aviation. So you have different kinds of learners. If they have a good attitude towards the subject, though, and usually those younger people and the older people as well, they're usually highly motivated to learn, and so that's really an important piece of them receiving the information. It's important too that they have read the material prior to coming to any lesson that you might be conducting. So we'll go on and talk about barriers. This is on page 4-4, chapter 4 again, 4-4. Some of the barriers that we encounter is a lack of common experience. I remember one time I was teaching a guy who was a bulldozer driver, and he kind of tried to drive the glider around like it was a bulldozer. He was very heavy-handed on the stick, and very definite movements on the stick that weren't necessarily what you needed to do to have a good feel for the sailplane. So, but as I mentioned before, the FARs require that they must be able to read, speak, write, and understand the English language. I mean, that's one of the requirements for being obtaining a pilot certificate, whether it's a student pilot certificate or a private pilot certificate or whatever certificate they're seeking. They must be able to read, speak, write, and understand the English language. Sometimes there's confusion between the symbols and the symbolized objects. What that means is, we refer to words. A typical word that I can think of is the word stall. An aerodynamic stall has a totally different meaning than an engine stall. Your car engine stalls and you coast to the side of the road. So, make sure that you define your terms and they're think the communication to be effective, you have to have a commonality to the language. Overuse of abstractions. I find new instructors, when I'm giving them exams, they use a lot of slang words and abstract words that aren't necessarily. I remember one time my one of my applicants, and this has been years and years ago. He was teaching me something, and we were coming close to the pattern, and he says, "Let's spin off a little altitude here." Well, I was flying. He was trying to instruct me how to fly, and what he meant was, let's do a 360 here or something like that. But I pulled back on the stick to get ready to do a little stall there, and he was flustered. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And I said, well, you said let's spin off a little altitude. I was going to get into a spin for you. And he said, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. So be careful about, your verbiage and what you're trying to kind of be precise in what you're asking for. So external factors, we have physiological factors, environmental factors, and psychological factors that all enter into this. I mean, if a person is getting airsick, well, they're physiologically, that's an external factor that's going to be a barrier to communication. They're not going to learn. You're better off to, land the glider, let them recover on the ground, and then go up another day. Whether it was just one of those days maybe they didn't eat properly or something like that. It not always just because it's rough weather. You have environmental factors which can be distracting as well. If there's other gliders in the pattern, or it's a really windy day or things like that your learner is more concerned about, well, then they're not going to learn. You're not going to be able to communicate effectively with them as well. And psychological factors, if they're distracted by something that's going on at home, or their wife or son or daughter are sick and they're concerned about them, and psychologically they're just not with you that day, that's going to be a really tough day to try to communicate with them. So, and interference. Sometimes the message gets disrupted or truncated, is what the book says. And what the best examples I can use there is that if you're trying to teach something and suddenly, let's say you notice a glider in conflict with you. Let's say you're thermaling with another glider and they turn abruptly inside of you. Well, that's going to disrupt the communication. They're going to be concerned about that sailplane turning inside in the middle of the thermal on you, and that is going to be concerning, but it is going to affect your ability to communicate with them as well, because they'll be distracted. They'll have that interference. Do we have any comments so far that we should discuss on the panel, or does anybody else have some ideas here?
So far, no questions, so we're good there.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on. So, developing communication skills. One of the ways that we develop our communication skills is by role playing, and that's that's the scenario-based training type things. We role play. Especially in the instructor regime. I'll say, well, I'm a student pilot, and you're going to teach me how to fly the pitch attitude and how to make simple turns. Well, I'm playing the role of that, and so I may intentionally make errors and see if you, the instructor, can identify those errors and communicate effectively to me as how to correct those errors, what I could do differently what I could notice differently, what I could do differently to maintain the airspeed while I was turning, or to maintain the bank angle while I was turning. And that's, that's also the instructional communication part of it. I mean, you have to be succinct in your communication when you're trying to correct somebody, an error that they're making or whatever, so that you can use your words carefully and precisely so that they can understand and correct that situation. You also have to be a really good listener. Both you and your learner have to be good listeners, because if you don't hear what they're saying, you don't interpret what they're saying in the way that they're meaning it to be. In, let's say they say, I don't really understand this coordination thing. How do I coordinate, and why am I coordinating between the aileron and the rudder? So if you don't really understand what they're trying to communicate to you, it's very difficult for you to offer some instructional uh, aid to their dilemma. So it's important when you listen to them that you get the message across. I always tell applicants when we're on a practical test, if there's any question in your mind as to what I'm asking for, what maneuver I'm asking you to demonstrate or anything like that, I want you to ask me, because, communication is really important between the two of us so that you do what I'm expecting you to do. Because if you do something differently or entirely differently, well, then that's that I'm not expecting you to do. Well, then the outcome might not be exactly what either one of us want it to be. So always ask questions, and that's where I was going with this. I said, always try to ask questions and clarify the communication if there's anything at all not understood. We teach that more so. Well, in my experience as an instrument instructor, we're always teaching our learners that if you have any questions about what the ATC instruction was, you should always, in that case, stop the airplane, and if you're taxiing on the ground, stop the airplane and make sure that you're understanding where you're allowed to go or not go, or whether you should hold short of or whatever. And that can be said true of, a motor glider applicant or motor glider learner who's taxiing around on an airport with an operating control tower. It's kind of a little bit of a different environment than they may be used to taxiing around at the local airport with grass runways and no control tower. So always question if you're unaware or unknowing of what's being asked of you by ATC. Well, make sure that you question them. And communication skills can offer instructional enhancement as well. A good communicator, and I always hold up Bob Wander as one of the really good people that I've run across over the years, who's really a good communicator. I think he always seems to offer a little different point of view and can communicate well with the learners that he's trying to communicate with. So the chapter summary on communication, this is a fairly short chapter, only 10 pages. I'll just read it to you. An awareness of the basic elements of the communicative process, source, symbol, and receiver, is the foundation for a successful communicator. Recognizing the various barriers to communication further enhances the flow of ideas between an instructor and the learner. Instructors develop communication skills in order to convey desired information to the learners. They also recognize that communication is a two-way process, and in the end, successful communication has taken place if the desired results have been achieved. fairly simple statements there, but that's sums it up pretty well, actually, I think. So, do we have any questions about communication skills or what we're talking about with communications? Any
No,
panel
no
members
questions
have
have
any
come up.
further thing to add?
But in addition to the verbal communication, there is body language that we should be aware of. I can remember one case where I had an applicant, a learner, who just looked really dumbfounded when I said something. And when I finally realized that I had mixed AGL and MSL in the same sentence without clarifying it, and he was very confused about what I was asking him to do. So it was the visual cues, it was body language that led me to stop and say, wait a minute, what's going on? Why don't you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a good point, Rich. And I think it just enhance that a little bit. If I find that the learners who are really quiet are tough to read from an instructor standpoint. You have to really work at getting them to communicate with you so that you know whether the message that you're trying to get across to them is being received. And so like it says here, it's a two-way street, and we got to make sure that we get them to talk as well and communicate with us as well. It's not we'll talk about this in assessment. I think we're gonna, or maybe the teaching. Yeah, I think I was working on the teaching process today too, and that might be in the teaching process, which we'll get to next week. But one thing it talks about there is the different kinds of delivery methods, and this delivery method that we're using tonight, the lecture method, is not as effective, especially for um, newer learners. I think that people like yourselves who are in this audience have a little better comprehension of what we're trying to talk about, whereas new learners don't necessarily have any perception about what you're trying to talk about sometimes. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. And without that two-way process of give and take between you and the learner, it is sometimes difficult to understand where they're actually learning the material or not.
Yeah, Ron, Bob Wander here.
Yes.
And just a note to all of our attendees. If you want the candidate to do something on the ground, or if you want the candidate, the learner, to do something in the air, my advice is tell the candidate in the simplest possible declarative sentence what it is you want the candidate to do. Make it very, very clear. And that will help the candidate know what it is you as the master instructor want them to do. If, on the other hand, you go on for 2 or 3, 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 sentences, they will lose focus. They will have no idea what you want. So keep it simple. I often speak to my candidates as if English was not, in fact, their first language, but second or third. And that has worked. Over.
Thanks, Bob. That's very insightful. Thank you.
To follow up on that, years ago, I heard Bob Wander say the magic words, and that is instructors must learn to use an economy of words, right, Bob? And I love teaching instructors. Usually 50% of people who come to me for tech rides are CFI-G candidates or reinstatements. But I tell them, go home and work on your script and get those words down to a minimum with tremendous clarity. Derek Piggott, again, I refer to him too much. He said, all they hear is the first 6 words you say, and the rest of it is the peanuts, the adults talking, the wah, wah, wah. So see if you can get your communication down to just a minimum amount of words and practice it. You can't do it in the air. You got to stay home and do your homework, Mr. Instructor. Okay, that's my take.
Thanks, Bert. Appreciate that input.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, let's move on. We're going to talk about Yeah, okay. So we're going to talk about assessment next. So we're on the Airman's Aviation Instructor's Handbook, page 6-1 now. So we're in the assessment portion of it. And let's talk a little bit about some of the terminology that we'll be using during this discussion. There's the traditional assessment, which is generally speaking an assessment at the rote level of learning. You know, like what is the stall speed of the ASK-21 in clean condition, you know, clean level flight, or that's a kind of a rote level learning of a piece of information. Written testing is good at assessing to the rote level of learning. So it's not very good at testing above the rote level of learning. It can be, depending upon how the test is designed. We'll talk about that a little bit here in a few minutes. Authentic assessment use specific performance criteria or standards, and you know the best thing that I can think of there is the PTS, ACS in terms of airplanes, but the practical test standards when it comes to gliders, and so those are the criteria or standards that we use for a practical test, and those will be the criteria and standards that you use as you get people prepared for the practical test. However, I often ask instructors, well, what criteria or standards do you use when you're getting a student pilot ready for solo? Because again, remembering all the things we've talked about through the weeks prior to this, one of the things is we want to be consistent in our evaluation. And so you have to have some kind of criteria or standards to utilize. And it's not, they can't necessarily be held to the same standards as a private pilot would be held to before they solo. However, they're, you know, in the glider flying handbook, they have common errors in almost every maneuver that you're going to be teaching them. And so I suggest to new instructors and old instructors alike that you use those common errors as your assessment tool when you're trying to assess whether this person is ready for solo flight. So that's what authentic assessment is. Diagnostic, formative, and summative. Let's talk about those next. Diagnostic assesses the learner's knowledge or skill before the instruction. So in other words, if you want to get a good idea about your learner's strong areas and their weak areas before you even get started, well, do a little assessing, do a little asking questions and posing scenarios. Excuse me, and see if they understand how to understand the way you've been teaching them, and can create a solution to the scenario that you propose. So the formative part of the assessment terminology would be provide a wrap up of the lesson. In other words, a debrief, as we call it. We want to make sure that we provide the learner with an evaluation of their performance, both good and bad. You know, but try to emphasize the good, to be quite honest, you know, to keep them motivated, and then try to suggest some areas that they could be improved. You know, I hesitate to use the word bad, although I just did. I mean, you're better off to, you know, praise them on the areas that they're doing well in, and advise them on the areas that they could improve on, and then provide how to make those improvements. You know, you just can't say, well, that turn was okay. Well, you know, provide some realistic critique of it. You know, you held the bank angle, you rolled into the proper bank angle using proper coordination. You um, were able to maintain the bank angle during the turn, but when you rolled out past the heading that you're trying to, you weren't within, you were about 30 degrees off of the heading that you were trying to roll out on. And you also forgot to relieve the back pressure on the stick. And so you climbed and decreased your pitch, or increased your pitch attitude and slowed down during the recovery of the turn. So, I mean, and the way to do that is concentrate on the pitch attitude as you roll out, because that's the important way uh, to have that happen. So, and then the summative is measures how well learning has progressed. So, at some point in time, you have to allow your learner to uh, perform the maneuvers without you saying a word. That's one way that you kind of know whether they're ready to solo or ready to take the practical test or whatever, is can they perform the maneuver without any comments from you, uh, constructive criticism from you. And that's a measure of how you can tell whether they've progressed the way that you want them to progress.
Ron, Wander here. Brief comment.
Yeah, Bob, please.
Yeah, when I was a new instructor a long time ago, I tried to tell everybody how they were doing. I learned in a long career to ask the candidate, how was your turn? How did, after any maneuver or procedure that I asked the candidate to do, how did you do? If the candidate could determine or identify the areas where he or she did well, that was good. And if the candidate could identify the areas where he or she did not do very well, that was even of more interest to me, because then they knew where their flaws were, where their weaknesses were. The candidate I worried the most about was the candidate who did everything badly. But when I asked him, him or her, how did we do? So we did great. That's a warning sign. That's a red flag. That candidate has not yet developed the critical faculties, the critical capability to assess his or her performance and bring it to a safe level. So, long story short, ask the candidate over and over after any maneuver or procedure that you've asked the candidate to do. Before you tell them how they did, ask them to assess how they did. And you'll learn a lot, trust me, from the responses that they give. Over.
Yeah, excellent point, Bob. I guess I didn't really emphasize that enough, and I appreciate you noticing that and bringing it up. You're absolutely correct. I mean, we, in the industry I was in, the airline industry, we called that a facilitated debriefing, and that the instructor would ask the candidate pilots who were taking the check ride or whatever how they think they did, and so. And it provides a great insight on the part of the instructor to be able to then have better understanding of the things that they're teaching them well, and the things that maybe you're falling behind on as well about how they teach them. Because if their perception is like Bob said, hey, I did a great turn, and I've had a few of those. In fact, I remember about 5 years ago. We had a person like that who just thought he could do no wrong, and it was just about the opposite. I mean, he was struggling to do things correctly, and so consistently. So good point, Bob. Very good point. Anybody else have any insights?
Bert,
Yeah, Bert.
my dad, Fritz Compton, a bit of a legend. When he heard someone say, "Oh, any landing that you can walk away from, or any landing you can use the glider again," was okay, and he said, "Bull." He said, "You go for the scale of 1 to 10. You try to make the takeoff, the cruise, and the landing a 10. You'll probably never get it, but you want a lot of nines for sure." And he just taught me that every landing is a precision landing, accuracy landing, especially in gliders. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, yeah, good points. Thanks for bringing those. We learn from our mentors, and I know Bert and I both had very good mentors, and I'm sure most of us have had good mentors through the years, and I know that we all learn from their mentors. So page 6-1, again, an effective assessment provides information to both the instructor and the learner. It should provide the opportunity for self-evaluation and decision-making and judgment skills. And a well-designed assessment highlights areas in which the learner's performance is incorrect or inadequate and helps the instructor to see where more emphasis is needed. Those are all points that Bert and Bob Wander just pointed out. Characteristics of effective assessments. It lists these 8 characteristics, and we'll try to just talk about them briefly. One of the characteristics has to be objective. It can't be your opinion, your likes, your dislikes, your biases. The instructors, that is what I'm talking about. They have to be objective about it, and the way to be objective about it is evaluate it based on the criteria that you can point to that should be be consistently evaluated by. So try to be objective in your assessment or your evaluation. Be flexible, fits the technique and the tone to the learner. Some people don't like it when you criticize them, and I think that's kind of human nature to some extent. None of us like that, and so be sure that you pick up or perceive the kind of learner that you have, and if they if they're going to shut down with any kind of criticism, try to avoid that. Try to instead offer encouragement of how they can improve in that area, rather than saying how poorly they did in that area. Acceptable, both the positives and the negatives. Comprehensive, both the strengths and the weaknesses. Constructive, use positive guidance for correction. We've been talking about that. Organized, logical, and make sense to the learner. Try to do the critique in an organized, or assessment in an organized and logical manner. Don't start off with when the glider rolled to a stop. Try to start off with when the glider started to roll, and so try to do it in a logical methodology. Thoughtful. All people have self-esteem. They have want recognition and approval. So I didn't spell approval correctly there. I'll have to go back and correct that. But you got to be considerate of those items. And so if you recognize that people like learners like recognition, they like approval, because that kind of builds up their self-esteem, I think you'll find that people will respond better to the assessments that you give. And specific, offer suggestions on how to improve. Just don't say that was a lousy landing and walk away. Try to offer suggestions about how they can improve that landing. If you'd have flared so that the glider, you stopped the flare at a foot off the ground instead of stopping the flare at 3 feet off the ground, it wouldn't have impacted the ground so hard. So try to offer suggestions about how they can improve with their performance. Traditional assessments. We talked briefly about this earlier. Characteristics of a good written assessment. Reliability. We kind of dwelled on that a little bit. Be consistent. Validity. Measure what it's designed to measure. If you're trying to get them to do a weight balance, well, the written assessment should be designed to measure. That's not a good example. Let's if they're trying to determine whether they know what the airspace rules are, well, make sure that the test is measuring that. Excuse me, is measuring what the different kinds of airspace rules are, and specifically talk to those, or point them out on the chart so that they can identify what airspace you're talking about. Usability, one that's easily graded. That written assessments generally are true, false, or multiple choice or something like that, and so those are easily graded tests. Comprehensive, representing a sampling of objectives. Make sure that if you are going to talk about weight and balance, just don't talk about what arms movements and weight are. Talk about how the relationship between those to correctly evaluate if the aircraft is safe to fly, and whether it's flying within its underneath its maximum gross weight and flying within its forward and rearward most CG limits. So, and discrimination, distinguish the difference between the learners. So, learners are different, and so you have to assess them differently. A young learner might be more tolerant of being critical, and versus a more mature learner have some self-esteem there, and they're not quite as tolerant of the. They're more receptive to positive critique and suggestions on how they can improve versus telling them exactly what's wrong. So have a good understanding of the different assessments that different learners have. And we talked a little bit about authentic. We're just going to delve into it a little bit more. Learner-centered assessments, replay, reconstruct, reflect, redirect. I mean, you can, like in Condor now, you can actually replay the maneuver that you just did in the simulator. And so you can go through and replay that and assess it as you're going through. Reconstruct it, and you can usually verbally reconstruct it, and any maneuver or procedure that you're trying to assess and dissect it a little bit so that they have an understanding about the different aspects of the procedure or maneuver that you were talking about. So you can let them reflect on how they did. Let them involve them with the assessment, the learner-centered assessment. Involve them with the assessment and let them reflect, as Bob said. The person who's thinks they're doing well all the time and probably is not doing all that well all the time, and so try to get them to reflect or get them to talk directly about what they think they did well, rather than the whole thing was good. So, and then redirect their attention toward the areas where they could improve, and so that they are focused then on those areas for improvement. And when they go back and read the glider flying handbook or whatever they're reading, they can reflect and redirect their ideas and things like that for improvement. So maneuver or procedures grades. I know that we have a evaluation tool in our club where we grade the procedures on a scale of 1 to 5, and it's not necessarily uh, 5 is not necessarily a good grade. In fact, the way we delineate those is that if it's graded as a 1, it means that the instructor demonstrated the maneuver or procedure. If it's graded a 2, it says that the student was doing the maneuver under the instructor's supervision. A grade of 3 is the student, the learner is doing the maneuver under their own supervision and correcting errors and things like that. And a 4 would be as if the learner is doing the maneuver well enough to pass a practical exam. And a 5 would be if the learner is doing the maneuver well enough to be an instructor. It's instructor grade of maneuver performance.
Ron,
So,
Ron, Wander here. Can I weigh in
yeah,
on that?
sure.
Here's an alternative method that, to be honest with you, I find a little bit simpler that the Minnesota Soaring Club introduced and uses. Any maneuver or procedure, the first thing is, has it been introduced? Has the candidate been introduced to the maneuver or procedure in ground training or flight training? The next step is, has the candidate managed to acquire that skill to solo standard? So it's been introduced. Now it's at solo standard. The instructor no longer has to intervene. Finally, is it to private or commercial check ride standard? Just 3. Introduced, solo standard, check ride standard. And that's what we use in the Minnesota Soaring Club. And so far in my 30-year experience there, it's worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that's a good simple methodology, and certainly worth considering. And I don't disagree with you, Bob. That's if we keep it simple, the simpler that we can keep things, I think the better it is for everybody. That way, if you go in and look at that student's, if you get that student as or that learner as your for the day because their regular instructor is out or whatever, you have a way to evaluate their progress versus if you just write things in the logbook. I find that it's very difficult to evaluate the progress of a learner or student as you're trying to introduce new items or trying to perfect old maneuvers that have been already introduced. So keeping it simple is a good thing. That's right. And then again, under authentic assessment, assessing management skills, explain, practice, decide, manage, and decide. Can your learner explain to you what they're trying to accomplish? Like say when they're trying to do the weight and balance, can they explain to you where the moment or the arms come from? Can they explain to you how to obtain the answer of where the center of gravity is with the sailplane loaded? And they can do that through practice as well. The more that they do that weight and balance calculation, the better off that they can be. I mean, I unfortunately, I still find once in a while people come to the exam and they really don't understand what um, where to find the moment arms for the passengers or the pilot. It's pretty simple in a glider because there's basically a moment arm for the forward passenger or pilot and one for the rear passenger or pilot and maybe some baggage. In the more advanced sailplanes, you got water ballast and things, but for the most part, in the training sailplanes that we utilize, the calculation is fairly simplistic. So, and they manage those then and decide how to utilize that number that they have obtained to flying the aircraft. Is it number one? Is it within weight and balance? But if it is, well, then how is perhaps how is the sailplane going to fly with a forward CG limit that's at the forwardmost limit versus how a sailplane might fly at the aftmost limit. Effective assessment methods. First step: determine level of learning objectives. I guess we've already talked about that. Describe how to determine weight and balance. The second step would be to list indicators and samples of desired behaviors. Can the learner accomplish the task? Can they actually do what we just described, is to accomplish the task of doing a weight and balance and information accurately for to determine the CG of the sailplane. And then the third step is establish criterion objectives. Well, the objectives is to determine whether they're within the maximum gross weight, below the maximum gross weight, and within the balance limits of that the manufacturer set, right? So can the learner apply that information? And then the last step would be develop criterion reference assessment items. The PTS is an excellent example of that. It has the criteria and then correlation and of evaluation. And they correlate that information into an evaluation of how the sailplane might fly, depending upon if the weight is heavier than normal or within the limits. But if heavier, how does a heavier weight sailplane fly versus a lighter weight sailplane? What is the minimum sinking rates and what's the best zone D speeds, things like that. How can they correlate that weight and balance information into the actual practice? So critiques and oral assessments, page 6-10. Instructor learner critiques. So we've got instructor-led critiques of the learner. We've got learner-led critiques, and that was one thing that Bob was pointed out, was that you'll be surprised at how much you learn from the learner if they lead their own critique of or assess their own performance. We have small group critiques, and I don't find those to be quite honest as helpful. I think people sometimes are a little sensitive to those kinds of things, and so I don't tend to use small group critiques very much personally. Individual learner critiques by another learner, and again, that's a little bit difficult unless the two learners are good friends and they can, they know how each other, their behaviors are toward each other, and so certainly they can lead by that. And I find, actually, to be quite honest, that when I ran a glider school, that some of the people that learned the quickest were people who came out with a buddy, and them and their buddy came out and they learned together, and we could do the two on two type of instruction and learner critiques. They sometimes might pick up on something that I might not pick up on.
Ron,
yes.
wander here very quickly.
Yes.
When I get my wave and I'm doing flight instruction, I like to have two candidates with me for 3 or 4 hours at a time, a pair of them, that are at the same level in their ground and flight instruction. And what I do is I will have candidate A fly with me, dual flight, and candidate B will meet us and use the golf cart or whatever we're using to retrieve the glider back to the flight line. I will have the two candidates talk to each other about how each one did. For instance, candidate A takes off with me in the back seat. Candidate B's job was to be on the ground and watch every single aspect of that takeoff and climb out, and every single aspect of candidate A's approach and landing, and then critique that to the candidate that just flew. It works. Then the next flight will be the candidate who did not recently fly will be the next one to fly. And the candidate remaining on the ground who runs the wing and comes to retrieve us will deliver his or her assessment of how that candidate did. It builds great esprit de corps. The assessments by the candidate on the ground are almost never wrong. They know what the goal is. And that what happens is a great team camaraderie builds if you can work your flight instruction this way, that the peer pressure and the peer communication and the peer cooperation work beautifully to help each candidate do the best they can in the shortest possible time. Over.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, like I said, I noticed that myself when people would come up with it, put out with a buddy. You know, they seem to learn better, and I didn't necessarily use that technique that you just talked about, Bob, but I think that that's a very valid technique and one that instructors should consider to be useful. So self-critique, usually I find that when I have people critique their performance on a check ride, they're perhaps many times more critical of their performance than I would be. But not to say that they're wrong. And like Bob just observed, most times they're correct. They have a pretty good perception of, especially by the time they get to the check ride, they have a pretty good perception of what they're trying to accomplish, and so many times they critique themselves more harshly than maybe I would. So written critiques are, one of the things that you as an instructor have to do is you have to go through the knowledge exam if a person's required to take one, whether it's a student pilot written test or whether it's the knowledge test that they have to take their private or their commercial pilot certificate. And then you have to go through that. You have to critique that performance and correct it to basically 100%. It's your responsibility as instructor to critique those written assignments. So oral assessment, normally an oral assessment is the type of assessment that we use while we're giving flight instruction. I try to limit my oral assessment in the air to some extent so that they can concentrate on their flying and try to do most of the oral assessment on the ground. I have to think about, I have to remember what we did and try to do it in an organized fashion. But I try to talk more on the ground than I do in the air. So characteristics of effective questions, we talked about that. Types of questions to avoid. Try to avoid. I mean, I've often said I'd like to ask one question on the practical exam, and that is, tell me how to fly from point A to point B on a cross country flight. Because realistically, if they can do that, they have to demonstrate knowledge about what the pilot has to have in order to carry passengers, if the passenger is going to be carried, what the recency of experience is concerned, the fact that they have to have some kind of flight review assessment in the past 24 calendar months, the fact that they have to think about the airplane or the sailplane in this case, and how to evaluate its condition. The fact that they have to talk about the environment. If you use the PAVE checklist in this instance, the environment, not only normally people talk about the environment only in terms of weather, but there's much more environment things to talk about, such as the airspace environment that we operate in, and the knowledge about the airspace that we have to have in order to operate safely in that environment. The environment of mountains, if the terrain is going to be a problem, that's another part of the environment that we have to be considerate of, whether it's the hills of the Smokies or whether it's the mountains or the Sierras. We have to consider that as part of the environmental portion of the preparation for a flight. And then answering learner questions. If you don't know the answer to the question, you may have to defer to the next session that you have with them, but try to write it down and do some research, and so that when you meet with that learner the next time, you can talk about, hey, you remember I left off that I didn't have a good answer for you. Well, I did some research and here's what I've come up with, and then go through that, answering that question again. They may have totally forgot about it, but they'll be impressed that you remembered, and you'll get some real learning done there, because you will have done the research necessary to convey the message now that you couldn't convey before. So it's really important to answer your learners' questions and do it correctly. Don't just try to BS it. Try to do it correctly. And if you honestly don't know what the answer is, well, then either research it right on the spot if you have time to open the book and look in the book and do a little research. But if you don't, make sure that you've done research in the meantime and can answer their question later. Scenario-based training. Well, scenario-based training, as we all know, is really an effective way to evaluate. In my opinion, it's an effective way to evaluate your learners' progress. Effective way to evaluate decision-making and risk management skills, including single pilot resource management. You'll want to orient new learners to the scenario-based training system, help learners to become critical evaluators. It helps your learner evaluate their progress. And it's also going to introduce the learner on how they will be evaluated during a practical test, because we evaluate using scenarios. Scenario-based evaluation is what the FAA demands of us as examiners as to how we evaluate your performance. And so, we don't just go up and do stalls. I mean, I try to create a scenario. You're coming in on final approach and you don't think you're going to make it over some wires at the end of the runway. And so you slow down a little bit, and then you slow down a little bit more, and then you slow down a little bit more, thinking you're going to get above the wires. And suddenly you find yourself short of the wires in a stalled condition. So that's, one way to introduce scenario-based training and scenario-based evaluation. Steep turns. I mean, the scenario in a sailplane in a steep turn scenario is thermaling, right? I mean, that's how we stay up. That's people have to, the instructor, have to train people on how to thermal very accurately, how to maintain a good, accurate pitch control, how to maintain a good, accurate bank angle control, so that they stay in the thermal. If you're speeding up and slowing down all the time, you're not going to stay in the thermal. If you're changing your bank angle all the time, you're not going to stay in the thermal either. If you're not, you could be changing the bank angle to adjust where you perceive that the best part of the thermal is. But in general, if you're letting the lift current in the thermal bounce you around to the extent that you're not trying to maintain a constant radius, then that's not going to be, you're not going to stay in a thermal. So I try to introduce scenarios as to why we're doing these maneuvers, why we're practicing these things. The accuracy landing is another, one. Why we practice accuracy landing? Well, it's because you may be faced someday with trying to land in a 600 or 800-foot field, and you want to make sure that you can accurately know where you're going to touch down and stop in that field. And so I try to teach, and I think most instructors try to teach, that every landing that you make, that whether it's at your home field or wherever, should be an accuracy landing. You should try to practice that accuracy landing concepts all the time, every landing. And so a chapter summary here. This chapter describes the methods and techniques for aviation instructors used to assess learners' progress. A well-designed and timely assessment defines what is worth knowing, enhances the motivation, and improves the learning. Today's learners want to know the criteria by which they are assessed, and they want practical and specific feedback. Flight instructors familiar with different types of assessments know how and when to use them and to promote a productive learning environment. I think, again, that sums up this chapter very well. And anything from the panel?
Yeah, Wander here.
Yeah.
I have a quick ton of things to say. I hope I'm not the only one. For those of you who want to become instructors, this book that we're looking at can be very intimidating. I mentioned last week, and I'll say it again this week, go to your past experience. Think about the good instructors you had in any discipline at any time and write down what it was that made them good instructors. Then go back to any discipline you ever studied from grade school on and identify the poor instructors, the ineffective instructors, and write down what they did or didn't do that made them ineffective. And you will be 2/3 of the way to becoming a good instructor if you study what your good teachers did and do not do what your lousy instructors did. Then I'll leave it at that. I'll have more to say if we have time, but I'll leave it at that. So other panelists, over?
We're here. At the end of the day, and I often have two candidates going for the same pick ride, but preparing them and then handing them off to another instructor to recommend them back to me. But nevertheless, and that's allowed. At the end of the day, I say, hey, any questions? And they go, no. I say, good, I want 10 questions tomorrow morning. And sometimes I get 20. And because that night they're going to lay there and say, what did Bert mean by that? It also throws it back at me. If they got 10 questions about, what did you really mean about that? That scenario or weight and balance. And why do we bother with it? It shows that I'm not getting my communication together, my economy of words, and my preparation. Again, looking back at my best educators, my professors through the college years, the ones that were prepared and also seemed to really love what they were doing. I don't do this because I get free toes. I mean, I do it because I love it. But the ones that were well prepared and enthusiastic were fantastic motivators in my college years and high school. Anyway, 10 questions at the end of the next morning. Boy, does that reflect back on you, how you did yesterday.
Yeah, good point. I agree. I think that I've heard that comment way too many times. Do you have any questions at the end of a lesson, or whatever? And very few applicants, very few learners are going to be able to come up with questions, to be quite honest, has been my finding as well. It's and another way that I've heard people or heard instructors talk about that is, well, if you don't have any questions, then I have a few of you. And, and I start asking them a few questions because to try to get some perception on my part as an instructor as to how effective the training I'm trying to give is actually going through. Do they really know what speed they should be flying in these conditions? Do they really know how to do a forward slip versus a side slip, and how that affects the approach path of the sailplane? And so I'll ask a few questions to get to see what they have to say about it, because if they can talk to me about that, again, this is communication to some extent. If they can talk to me about that topic, well, that means that they do have some understanding, at least some level of learning, that is understanding, higher than just the rote level of learning. And then if they can actually demonstrate that concept to me in the air, or on the ground, if it's a ground-based type lesson, now they have an application level of learning, which is next to the correlation. And so we try to teach and try to assess at the correlation level of learning as much as we can, because we want to make sure that people can take what we taught them and can apply it in other areas other than just the areas that we're teaching them in. So, Rich, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I'd like to remark on all of these comments the last three speakers have made, is that as an instructor, we need to make sure that we're communicating clearly and assess our performance as how well we're doing as an instructor. And I think that's what all three of you just said, is how am I going to assess my performance as the instructor in addition to the learner's performance in doing whatever lesson was we're practicing. I found I had a youth who, if I give him a declarative statement, he'll just say the statement back, not demonstrating any kind of understanding or knowledge. And I have to change the way that I want to present the information and evaluate how well they're doing and evaluate how well I'm doing as the instructor. So that's also a two-way street. How's my critique and evaluation going for what I'm trying to accomplish?
Carlson and everybody wander here. Bert Compton just taught me how to be a better instructor. I've been doing this for 45 years. And he said, you know what, bring me 5 or 10 things that you don't understand tomorrow. Bert, thank you. And for those of you who are listening, this becoming a really good teacher is a never ending campaign. You can always do a little better. And Bert, thank you. I wish I'd thought of that 20, 30, or 40 years ago, but I've got it now and I stole it from you. Next item, I'd like to make just a very short remark about scenario-based training. Those of you who are listening tonight, 70 or 80 of you, Ron Ridenour was an Alpha captain for United Airlines and so on, and had 35, 40 years of training in scenario-based training. Many of you don't have that background, nor do I. I'm not an airline guy. So I'm going to try and make SBT, scenario-based training, simple for you to think about. Just present the candidate with a problem. What would you do if the tow plane isn't making good power, if the rope breaks, if you see a traffic conflict, if there's a crowd on the run, if you can't land at your home airport, if the weather is going down? What if? And you're really 2/3 of the way towards performing scenario-based training with your candidate. SBT is one of 1.4 billion 3-letter acronyms that we have in aviation. It's not as complicated as it sounds. What would you do if is 3/4 of the way towards getting scenario-based training to work. for your candidates. Over.
That's very
Yeah,
good.
Yeah,
very
wait,
good.
one more thing. Thanks, Bert. Thanks for the tip. I wish I'd thought of it myself, but I got it from you. I stole it fair and square. Over.
Thanks. That's a good evaluation of what SBT, the bottom line of SBT is. And I remember when, we first started talking about this 25 or 30 years ago, to be quite honest, and I struggled with it for a while, but I utilize accident reports too, NTSB accident reports, and I present those scenarios, not necessarily what the accident, but I, the cause of the accident. I'll let the student try to figure out what they would have done differently to have avoided the accident, and so it's an interesting thought processes, and obviously, the NTSB reports offer you a a baseline to start with about some of the things that you want to talk about, but it doesn't have to be that complicated. Just like Bob says, what would you do if the tow plane started rocking his wings here at 300 feet? Hopefully they're going to release, but now what are you going to do? So it's a more complex question than initially meets the eye, and it requires some thinking on the part of your learner applicant. So
I've also found that using PAVE is a great way to create scenarios because you get the pilot skills and knowledge you want them to think about. The aircraft, it may be a factor, the environment you're operating in, and the external pressures. You can emphasize some or a few of these, but it helps you write a little story.
Rich, a lot of our listeners, I think, would not know exactly what you mean when you say PAVE, PAVE. Could you please elucidate the pilot, aircraft, environment, external pressures model? Over.
Well, you just did, Bob, and that is part of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook and the risk management stuff that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks.
yeah, it's we're going to talk about that the last week on the 30th of the month. We're going to talk about that exactly. So and PAVE will be a big part of that discussion.
I just
So
have
these are go ahead. I'm listening.
There's one more thing I want to emphasize is that I get too many people on check rides who I say, you always do a left-hand pattern. Let's do a right one, a right pattern. Slips to landing, no air brakes in a right pattern. And that my instructor never showed me a right pattern. And I'm just not appalled. I can see where the rote thing going around, but I think too many instructors fail to demonstrate and they try to talk people through it without the economy of words. In other words, an instructor has to take the controls and show people. I think too many instructors let the student blunder along. And like when I used to teach guitar, you don't practice mistakes in music. You slow it down and make it right. The same thing with teaching people to fly. Instructors need to demonstrate, take the stick, take the whole flight if you have to. And you're taking away some stick time from the student, but that'll save them 5 toes if you can just demonstrate what it's supposed to look like. Stop it, Bob. My dad was my mentor, but I watched Bob wander through the years. In fact, it was the first PowerPoint presentation at an SSA convention in Arlington, Texas. Derek Piggott got up there with his big model, told the whole crowd, okay, put your arms out and make a turn. Okay, those of you who didn't look first, sit down, you just died. And then Tom Knopf got up there with his overhead projector thing and do it my way or die. And I'm just simply quoting him. I've heard him say that twice, but very good instructor. And then Bob Wander came up and he had the first PowerPoint I ever seen. And the clarity of it and the simplicity of it, and like his books, specifically Safer Soaring, a collection of his presentation and articles, it's Reader's Digest all the way. It's unlike some of our FAA publications, which are written by technical writers who are not glider pilots. But the point is, the simplicity that Bob and the clarity that Bob has brought to it makes me a better instructor. So there, Bob.
And as I told you earlier, 5 minutes ago, Bert, your technique of give me 5 or 10 questions tomorrow without fail just taught me how to be a better instructor. So thank you for the compliment and right back at you. Over.
Clarity, economy of words, clarity, simple, at least simple at first. Wind gradient, we get a lot out here in Marfa, Texas today. They say, watch out for the dropout. Instead of trying to explain on short final what the wind gradient is all about. Again, preparation before the flight on a windy day, that's the time where you explain and draw pictures and fly a model glider through a wind gradient 20 feet over the runway. That's the demonstration part that I think many instructors try to talk a learner through. Okay, I'm hungry.
Okay.
The glider course. So.
All right. Well, thanks for your participation, everybody, with this webinar. I appreciate it. As you can see, we're going to talk about the teaching process. I was going to try to talk about it tonight, but I wasn't quite ready. I've got those slides I'm almost done with those slides, and we'll be talking about that next week. And then the final week, as Rich mentioned, we're going to talk about Chapter 1 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, risk management and single pilot resource management. So I hope you all look forward to that. I look forward to seeing you in the coming weeks, and we'll finish this up. Hope you're all starting to do a little flying. I know we are here in the Midwest, and I hope you have a safe soaring season. But hope to see you in the next couple of weeks, and we'll try to get this part of this flight instructor course finished up. So,
Bert here would like to make a short advertisement for the site survey program, which I developed when I visited Sweden and saw how they do it, and I brought it back to the Soaring Safety Foundation years ago. I've done 144. We have done 144. I've done most of them. I have 6 lined up now. I believe we budget for a few more than that because the site survey of your club is A, you have to invite us. B, it's free and confidential. It's just you and me, and I don't write anything down. I give you a form and you write it, you take it home and you fix things that you might be doing differently. Not necessarily wrong, but things that could be improved upon. And again, it's friendly. Hey, it's Bert. But let's get anybody who wants a site survey for their club, please contact us or me, and specifically you can find all that at the soaringsafety.org website. So I got time this July. You know why? I'm tired of the really hot West Texas weather. I'll go somewhere else where there's a little moisture in my hair, in the air. Anyway, I'm available.
And
Thank you.
Bob Wander here on behalf of the Soaring Safety Foundation. I strongly endorse the site survey program. Bert does a great job. Over.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Bert, and thanks for the recommendation, and thanks for your support. And Rich, I think we're going to be starting up the FERCs. Don't start up again until the fall. Do we have one in November this year or not?
Yeah, we should be in Etowah in November,
Okay, so
and then
That-
9 more. So
I was going to say we have 10
January.
next year, and so we'll. And I think we won't have an SSA convention this year, but the following year. So
Right.
I'll have to make sure we coordinate that with FERCs as well.
Rich, for our newbie instructors, can you list the state, the locations, the venues of the flight instructor refresher clinics, specifically so that 70 some people that are listening might want to use that as a renewal?
So we don't do any clinics because we're not clinicians,
Courses.
but
Courses.
we do courses, and based on where we were 2 years ago, we will be in Edo, Tennessee, Moriarty, New Mexico, Washington, D.C., Hutchinson, Kansas, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Seattle, Washington, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Tucson, Arizona, Boston, Massachusetts, and Los Angeles, California, all between January and April.
And if, for those of you who are not instructors but are attending this online course that Ron Ridenauer is presenting, the invitation is for you to come to those and rub shoulders for 2 days with the instructors who are refreshing their privileges, and obviously with the instructors who are presenting the courses as well. This is a great opportunity to really learn how to become an instructor. Over.
Okay. Having said that, I think we're going to bid you adieu tonight. So thank you very much for your attention, and hope to see you all back again here next week. I'll be much better on time. Sorry about being a little late tonight. So take care. Thanks very much for your attention.